Welcome to the Chiefs. The Chiefs is a Whiteark podcast aimed at specifically giving you an insight into what makes great leaders and entrepreneurs in a variety of organisations tick. We call them Chiefs. My name is James Ciuffetelli, and together with my Whiteark co-chief, Joe Hands, we're going to attempt to take you on a journey and talk to as many chiefs across as many industries as we can to give you an insight into A, what makes them tick, and B, what makes their enterprises thrive, and more importantly, what they've learnt along the way. The Chiefs.
I'm very excited today to have Vincent, the CEO of Stanford Brown, a financial planning firm with a difference. Vincent made CEO in October 2020, but has been with the firm for nearly 14 years. Stanford Brown rebranded recently with a new focus on tough love, going deeper on the things that matter, listen to what clients want, and have the difficult conversations and tackle the biggest issues and act in your best interest. I'm very excited today to have Vincent with us to talk to us about his leadership journey, what he's learned along the way, and I'm sure our listeners will get a lot of insights into hearing from Vincent. So thank you so much. I'm going to launch into the questions now, Vince.
Thank you, Joe. That's a pleasure and excited to be part of the podcast. Thank you.
Fantastic. So the first question for you is, what is your personal theme for 2021?
Yeah, so we actually were fortunate enough to do our first staff conference or offsite only a couple of weeks ago, where I was able to set out part of the plans for the year ahead, or actually the vision for the 5 years ahead, to our staff. And it's nice to be able to do these things again in a touchwood semi-post-COVID world. But the theme for the conference was navigating the uncharted waters. And there's probably a couple of aspects to that. One is a lot of businesses are still reformulating what a semi-post-COVID world looks like for them in terms of their staff, in terms of working habits, in terms of their customers, in terms of how they interact with their customers. And for us, yes, we're still working our way through some of that, but also our industry is going through a significant amount of upheaval at present. So the financial services industry has had a lot of change in regulation. New regulators are changing regulators in the sphere, and significant rising compliance burdens, education standards, and all of that. And I guess from our perspective, we broadly welcome a lot of that. There was definitely, unfortunately, too many instances where the right client outcomes, the right customer outcomes were not being achieved by the industry, and therefore change was required. But it is seeing huge numbers of advisors leave our industry, and those that remain are probably going to be larger businesses, and certainly ones with the infrastructure required to offer the compliance and the technical service required to the clients. So we're sort of combining a convergence. The theme for the year ahead has been a convergence of post-COVID disruption, the disruption of what's happening in our industry, and then to take that and focus on it and say, well, for a firm like ours, where we feel, touchwood, we've been ahead of the curve in quite a few of these developments, what are the opportunities in it for us, and what are the growth opportunities in it? And then also at my personal angle to it was very much around sustainable growth. So we're fortunate enough within our business to have a number of individuals. Myself, I've been here 14 years. One of our other directors has been here 15 years plus. Our CFO's actually worked here 24 years.
Wow.
It's about trying to say to some of the younger staff, when you talk about growth and targets and all those things that companies talk to their employees about, it's also about trying to create balance and sustainability for them in their world so they can sort of avoid the inevitable burnout and things. And certainly, particularly in the last 12 months, because many people have struggled with that working from home balance, that convergence of work and family, and trying to help. I just shared a few personal stories for myself around what's worked to help create and try and maintain that balance in my world.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that whole concept, Vince, of sustainable growth, right? And the other thing that I took out of that was opportunity, right? So I think everyone and every company has been impacted by COVID a different way. But what is clear is there is a lot of opportunity off the back of it. And so it's how you kind of navigate to make sure that your company is ahead of that opportunity, or personally you're ahead of that opportunity.
In a lot of ways, for a lot of businesses, COVID has probably just accelerated some trends that were already there, certainly the digital trends and other things. And it's about saying, well, were you positioned well for it? Did you have a strategy to deal with that? Because you possibly need to fast track if you don't.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the companies that really lean in on some of that stuff are probably in 12 or 18 months' time going to be the companies that have delivered an unbelievable piece. And there's that piece that you mentioned around kind of navigating the kind of uncertainty about where we're at the moment. And, as I talk to some of our clients, what we're getting is we're not sure necessarily what our next step is because we don't necessarily have a full view of where we're going to land or where normality ends up. And I think for me, it's that people being able to, as a leader, navigate through the ambiguity that we're in the moment and making the best of the opportunities is a really interesting challenge.
Yeah, the way that we've approached that is to put in place sort of a 4 to 5 year vision for the firm in terms of where we think we could or should be at the end of this period, however long it may be. And then one of the primary purposes of that is, as well as it's just good to go through the exercise of trying to make some of those decisions, it then should provide a bit of a North Star for us or a guiding post where we say, well, when we're making decisions, because particularly when you deal with uncertainty, and I think back to 12 months ago, you're having to make so many decisions every day, somewhat on the fly with half information. Well, as we come out the other side, there'll be maybe not the same intensity decisions, but still many required. The advantage of the vision is to help us think, well, if we've got a close call or if it's something, which is going to help better get us to that end outcome that we're going to get. And, if we make this decision today, does that set us backwards? Do we have to then make some further adjustments to get back on track? It really to help keep a medium to long-term view on where we're going strategically and vision-wise to then help guide the inevitable multitude of decisions we've got to make along the way.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think having that clear vision and people being clear on what that is and people buying into it, some companies do that better than others. And then I think that in some cases, people's businesses have been changed so much by COVID that they're questioning whether their vision is right. In most cases, their vision is right? It's just that how to get there has changed. And I think people are probably struggling with that.
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that we did do well through the COVID period was you talked before about the sort of rebranding that we did at the back end of last year, but that was really the end, it was sort of the midpoint of a process. If we went back and took this opportunity to reassess just who we are, what we stand for. Obviously, we know the industry we're in, we know the sort of clients that we're largely targeting, but we did revisit that. Have we got it right? And then are we communicating or are we articulating as well as possible what we think are our core differentiators or value adds to our clients and to the broader market, and really take that time to come out the other side incredibly confident about just where we want to position ourselves, what we stand for, and who are, I guess, the right target clients and the right people for us to be working with, staff-wise, client-wise. And that's been an incredibly beneficial exercise in terms of, again, positioning us for the decisions that we have to make over the next 3-4 years.
And probably in hindsight, it was actually really good timing because doing that reset before things kind of went, where they went, I think it gave you an anchor point, and it probably was there before, but it was fresh in people's mind. Yeah,
it just forced it to really become front and center, which was definitely beneficial.
Yes, great. So the next question I have for you is, could you tell us a little bit about your leadership journey?
As you've probably picked up from the accent, not a Sydney native. So I've got probably 3 main arcs to my career, and the first 2 are quite short. So I grew up in the north of Ireland. I went to university in Dublin and studied commerce and law there, and then worked for 3 years in Dublin. And I worked actually for a firm called Paddy Power, which is the parent group of Sportsbet in Australia, one of the largest gaming organizations, owns Betfair now in the world. And I took that job. I'd studied commerce and law, had an interest in business. Law probably hadn't been a passion of mine, but I just had done it to sort of add a bit of weight to the degree. And I took that job out of my love of sport. And I had quickly discovered over 2 or 3 years working in it that probably I would not have maintained my love of sport if I'd probably had stayed in an industry that kept me, almost conflicted with it at certain times. But it was an interesting place to work because it had a lot of finance professionals actually working in there. There's a huge amount of analytics and things that they were doing as a business. And I was working in a junior sort of operational role as a risk manager. But I was fortunate enough to actually, 12 months into the job, be given a role managing fairly young junior team, but about 10, 12 people. And I guess I was quite happy to take that role, but I probably made some mistakes in it as well along the ways. And I remember I was probably continually trying to hire people like me, assuming that they'd be motivated by the same things as me, and quickly learned, people are motivated by 101 different things. For some it might be financial, for some it might be status, for some it might be other, motivators. And probably lost a few staff through that period early on because mainly they wanted to go to different areas within the firm, which was fine. They were progressing their career, but it helped me understand early on from that just trying to replicate yourself is actually an inherently flawed way to build a team. So, I also then reached the point where I was going to do the migration to the Southern Hemisphere. And that probably called natural time on that career. But it was interesting for the few years that I was there. I worked with some incredibly impressive people in a very forward-thinking organization and did learn a lot. The second arc I would have is when I came to Australia, I was still working before I had my permanent residency in a series of 3 to 6 month contracting type roles. So almost all in sort of either finance or financial services roles. So I got to work in everything from the deepest, darkest parts of some of the big four banks to in some not-for-profit organizations. And that also was actually a really interesting learning experience because I got to work with, sometimes in fairly under-resourced organizations. And you saw the strains that would put on management and some of the consequences that would have on their behavior. And you just, in my role, no one really expected, unfortunately, too much of you. And it wasn't ever going to go too far, but it was an interesting place to sit on the side and observe. And I think in one of my finance roles, I was lucky enough to sit next to, in an open plan office, the CFO of one of the larger subsidiaries of one of the larger telcos, and just sit there and keenly observe their discussions, CapEx discussions and various other things. And I just got that seat because I didn't annoy her, unlike I think most people. So I got to get and sit there and observe what was going on. But it was a fantastic learning experience. And then when I came to Stanford Brown, that was about a career move. So I wanted to try and crack into the industry. And one of the biggest challenges I'd had was because I had a bit of experience on my CV already, it was quite hard to actually get an entry-level role. People thought, well, you don't want to take an administrative role because you're going to get bored of it quickly or you're going to move on. And that certainly for some of the larger organizations I interviewed with was something they couldn't get their heads around. I was fortunate in Stanford Brown and the leadership here were kind of more like, they just like to hire good people and throw them in there and what will be, will be. And it's been a fantastic sort of learning curve journey for me. So I'd worked essentially for 2 years in an administrative role and then became, while studying what was required to be an advisor, then sort of gradually transitioned to the advisor role, which I did for 2 to 3 years. And then the opportunity came up to take over a private wealth team at that stage, which might have been about half the size of what it is today. And even through that experience, that was quite a journey. And I've had a few learnings along the way there.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Like the different opportunities and the different experiences you get, and then it kind of gets you to where you are, and organizations giving you, hiring people for the sake of hiring really good people rather than getting caught up about what level you are. And it sounds like from a career perspective, you've had a lot of opportunity at Stanford Brown, which is what's kept you there, right? And got you to the position that you're in today.
Yeah, I'm very fortunate in that regard. In some ways, probably opportunities have come to me faster than I might have necessarily automatically been beating the door down to get them. It was just the way that the timing worked out that I was there, and obviously worked hard and sort of helped create the opportunities for myself. But it's been an organization where it's been growing simultaneously with my growth. So you haven't had to wait for, I guess, let's say some more stable or static organizations for someone to leave or retire to get the next move. There's been just continuous evolution, creating opportunities on the way through. And that's something we very much have focused on maintaining, because when we bring in young graduates or other talent, the best thing that we can do, obviously, or what we absolutely need to do to retain them is give them career trajectory.
Yeah, and it's not just, hey, these are the set roles we've got or these are the set levels, but actually, to your point, I think when a company's growing and that it's changing and it's evolving, that's where it does create the opportunities, but it does require you as an individual and the employees to lean in, right, on that and work out how to fill some of those gaps and how to step up. And in most cases in people's careers, they say that actually the opportunity might have come 6 months before they thought they were ready, but actually just embracing the opportunities when they come up and take them and grow into the roles.
Yeah, and I think also helping people understand that their roles are not static, in terms of sometimes as things evolve, people sometimes take on roles and responsibilities that they otherwise might not have wanted. They might have got drawn into management responsibilities, they might got drawn into other committees and things. And while they're doing a job there, it might not be their core passion, and it actually might be holding them back. So at times it's worth stopping, reflecting and saying, actually, you guys have a list of 10 things that you love doing. which also typically line up to be the 10 things that people are best at.
Yeah.
What other 10 things have happened to become part of your job remit, job description in the last couple of years that really we probably should now focus on carving off and give that to someone else that actually is better positioned, better skilled, and will do a better job of those things and allow us focus on growing and expanding you in the areas where you add most value. That's a really important exercise, because suddenly if you don't do it, every so often people can be just completely weighed down by the 20-30% of their role that sucks their energy because it's just not their passion and they don't do it that well.
Yeah, it makes sense. And you're probably right. Most companies don't do a good job of taking things off people's plate. They just keep putting things on, and that leads to other problems and burnout and all sorts of things where people then feel overwhelmed, right? So it's a good habit to get into to kind of make sure that you're moving things off people's plates as well.
Yeah, no, it's an important discipline.
So what are the key lessons that you've learnt, Vince, in your journey so far?
Yeah, look, I think that lesson early on in terms of understanding the needs, the motivators of the people that you hire is really important. Understanding the completely divergent motivators that some people have. Obviously, money's always there front and center, but some people are to a degree motivated by status. Some people are to a degree motivated by different passions or aspects of the role, and trying to understand that and help tailor the roles for what they want there. Over myself and my private wealth journey has been an interesting one, because I probably came into the role at a bit of early success. I definitely had probably come into the role green, let's be honest. I was coming back to management for the first time, and I'd run in sort of a small pod, so like a sort of diluted team leadership type role for a year or so before that. And that had a certain success, and that saw me step up to the head of the private wealth, which was a much greater role. And I probably went through for a period of overconfidence bias, which can be it inevitably ends with a bit of a reality check. So for myself, I'd gone through a journey there probably in my 6 years of the private wealth role of early days, a lot of things, luck or other factors, balls had bounced my way, things had worked out, and you became probably a bit overconfident in terms of whatever I'm going to do here is going to work out for me, and on we go. And then unfortunately you get a few reality checks due to bad luck or other circumstances, and you have a tougher year as any leader will have, where, it's not one where every target's hit and every key person's retained or every, hire you've made has been a huge success. You get a few things wrong. And that was confronting. I went through that period of sort of a natural bit of self-questioning. But ultimately, from myself at that period, the way I've always looked at it was, well, if nothing else, I would, even if I decided that this wasn't for me, I never want to finish on a low. So I want to work my way through it, come out the other side, re-steady the ship, set the next direction for the few years, and then I can make a clear head decision around whether it's right to hand over the reins to someone else or whether it's right to move on and do something different. And when you come out the other side, you're thinking in a clear head, and then instantly I've always found myself focusing on the future again. So it was probably not so introspective anymore. It was more back to what comes next. But I definitely have been fortunate enough also in my time as head of private wealth. So for the context of our business, Stanford Brown is essentially a private wealth company. It also has a very bespoke and sort of market-leading corporate benefits division that provides, particularly towards some of the finance and tech sector, consulting around different aspects of superannuation and insurance. But private wealth essentially makes up about 80% of our business. So in that role, I got to work very closely with our prior CEO as well and get a significant window to what was required and the stresses and the strains of the top job as well as in my own. So it was a rare sort of grounding point in terms of a role for what would possibly come next in terms of moving to CEO.
A couple of things that you said that are interesting in relation to, generally the thing where we learn the most is normally when things aren't necessarily going that right, or, you've got to work out how to navigate something that's a bit more complicated. So at the time it feels like it's the end of the world or things aren't really working out, but actually looking back, it's probably the area or the time where you learn the most about yourself, about how to lead. So it's navigating that piece. And to your point, having that role in leading the private markets is such a big component of the role that you're now currently in, right? And getting that kind of, whether it's mentorship, but even just being able to see how the CEO operates and being kind of involved a bit more in the detail of the day-to-day kind of helps you then work out what does it mean for you as you go into that CEO role.
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest learning I had of I call it a reality check. I don't want it to be too dramatic, but it was having been probably over self-confident, over optimistic.
Yeah.
The big advantage I got out of that was just managing my own expectations. And the reality of the role, any bit of leadership, is that you're going to have some better days and you're going to have some more challenge days. And you got to set your expectations on the standards you set for yourself and the outcomes that you hope to achieve in line with that. If you set yourself up hoping or expecting perfection, then you're going to just be set up for a litany of pain. So manage your expectations accordingly, manage your sort of emotions accordingly, and manage your energy levels. And that definitely was, a really beneficial period for me in terms of trying to just get my head set right for what might be required in the future.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. So what do you love about being CEO?
Of all the things, the thing that I like is almost the simplicity nature of the job, in that the black and white nature of the accountability. So in a way, in my prior role, you were head of the largest division, which was going to have a huge impact on sort of the bottom line, top line and bottom line. But the CEO carried a degree of the responsibility, and I carried a degree of the responsibility. And sometimes you sort of question marks over who was responsible for this, that, or the other. I just like the simple black and white nature of it. It's, I don't have to have any inner monologue or debates over whose responsibility it is. It's basically mine.
Yeah.
And if I've delegated to someone else, then it's still my responsibility to make sure they fulfill it and do it the way it should be done. So I really just enjoy the black and white nature of that. The ability to sort of say, well, how's everything going? If something's not performing, there's no question mark there in terms of where responsibility sits. It's with me either to directly intervene or to work with the leaders in those different areas to intervene. That's been probably the bit mentally that I've enjoyed the most, because I almost just like the clarity of that, the simplicity of that. I've been very fortunate. I've also sat on our board for 5 years, so I've got to see the CEO role from both sides of the chair. So I was very fortunate coming into the role to know, the challenges as well as the rewards of the role. But mentally, I have enjoyed the black and white nature of the simplicity of the accountability of it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, right? There's definitely a theme when I talk to leaders in organizations and senior leaders around being clear on who's accountable and responsible, that whole alignment piece at the executive level. So, as an exec group, are you aligned on where you're all heading? And, definitely have you got the right people in the right boxes to make sure that the business is set up for success? And that ultimately sits with the CEO, right? And sometimes those decisions can be hard, and sometimes those decisions can be easy, and sometimes it's going to be a great day and other days it's not going to be. How do you find the CEO role in terms of being lonely, or, do you have a mentor, or how do you think through that, or how do you see that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's funny, when I took the role, obviously a lot of people come out and give you the congratulatory messages, and that's nice. It is a nice little boost, but notable how many people privately then messaged me and said, hey, I know the role is going to be a lonely one, so don't hesitate to ever catch up and have a beer, have a coffee, or have a chat at some time. And they were people that have been in other significant leadership roles, either previously or currently elsewhere in the industry. And I think probably because I've always been reasonably comfortable with my own counsel, and I hold my own counsel in the exotic location of my car, driving to and from Coleroy most days, and that's where I probably make most of my key decisions. I haven't found that completely, but to be honest, 6 months in, I'm starting to understand it a bit more, because there's certain challenges of being a leader, and particularly for myself, I've been a very hands-on leader, so I like to get really involved in a lot of the day-to-day. And, very much get involved in helping people with decision making, helping people with, elements of pitching and a variety of different aspects of their work. And as I begin to then widen my umbrella to cover a greater portion of the organization, that just becomes less and less possible. So I now begin to face that bit of a grapple to say, well, look, we all need balance in our lives. I have a young family. I've got 3 children that are sort of 11, 9 and 7, or just about to turn 7. And you got to get balance. If I keep trying to run things the way that I did in the past, and that's not realistically going to be sustainable. So now where you see, I've begun to experience pressures that I probably haven't before. And I begin to now get maybe a feel for people say, well, it's quite lonely in that they're having to make those decisions. They're having to make those choices. And there's no one else realistically for them to discuss the trade-off with, except, close confidants or people that have had that experience before. But, I have been fortunate. I have been fortunate in that I had experienced the job from both sides of the table. So at such close hand, to not go into it with totally rose-tinted goggles and manage my expectations in that regard. So I sort of have been somewhat steeled for the gig to not have too much of a shock factor. The other thing that I have found quite interesting is just how you get different cultures and how they treat leadership. So some cultures are much more hierarchical and are very respectful of leadership. And I would probably myself come from a different culture to that, where it would have been confident in my own views, happy to challenge leadership regularly.
Yeah.
And having changed from, even though it was a senior role previously, to the top role, definitely symbolically in a lot of people's eyes, that's a big shift.
Yeah.
And how they operate and work with you is different. And I just see subtle little changes based on people's cultural outlooks and their own personal makeup, how they respond to you and how they interact with you, particularly even amongst peers. Now you're in a different role. So that's been one thing that I probably didn't expect to probably change, but I guess it's an inevitable thing.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one, isn't it? And I think it's cultural and it's generational as well. And without putting people into boxes, I think the way people respond to people in different roles. And because you've been at Stanford Brown for quite a long time, you've seen a lot of people come in, you've worked with a lot of people, you've been in that kind of running that private wealth area. So you've seen people from different perspectives, and all of a sudden, actually, you've changed your title, and yes, you've changed your role and where you stand, but then you see other people's behaviour change, and then that's strange in some ways, because you think, well, should there be a level of consistency across that? But it is probably very much a normal thing. So it's an interesting insight, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it was one of the things I was sort of almost chuckling to myself 6 or 8 weeks ago as I reflected on it, and started just the occasional comment here and there from both ends of the spectrum just makes me realise the role does make people treat you differently, more than I would have expected.
And then 2020 was really a rough year for a lot of people, right? You touched on it earlier, personally people struggle. There's definitely mental health challenges out there. Businesses struggled to go from how do I kind of manage this crisis to how do I actually not just survive but kind of thrive off the back of it. So what are you seeing in terms of the clients at Stanford Brown, and how are you navigating them through this change period?
Yeah, look, I think, again, go back 12 months ago, and I think back closely to that day that the US closed its borders to Europe, because I think that was the day that we realized, if we were in any doubt still at that point, that this was going to be a really serious and disruptive event. It was here for sure. The simple message in the first instance with regard to clients was just, and to staff as well, was communication. So at the very least, obviously, we don't have all the answers to everything that's about to play out, but you need to be on the front foot, communicating with clients, talking to them regularly. Yeah. There's a degree of reassurance, a degree of leadership, at least talk them through the things that we're assessing, the decisions that we're making, and help them know that you, one, aren't hiding, and two, that you are there to be with them and work their way through it. So a really, really strong emphasis on all forms of communication, but certainly personal communication to clients through the 12-month period. And then likewise to staff. So again, we had, I can think back, we were having, I think, weekly board meetings, daily management meetings to respond to the different rules that were being unleashed every day. And then you're finding ways to communicate that as effectively as possible to the staff. They were dealing with huge uncertainty. You're trying to find ways to give them enough information without overloading them and without overwhelming them.
Yeah.
And getting that balance right was really important. And then really quickly it became a focus as well internally about the team and the culture. So, we've always been fortunate enough to have an office where we work very hard, but we try not to take ourselves too seriously. So there's a fair bit of banter, for want of a better word, in the office. Again, everyone's certainly fair game on that. CEO very much included, and you bring it upon yourself. And conscious that that's very hard to maintain in an environment where once we're all basically physically isolated. So simple things like the importance of the team meetings and everyone being together on those team meetings and sharing some personal milestones or wins on your way through that, which would be things that you would otherwise do as part of your discussions in the office. The Friday afternoon drinks catch up on Zoom. It was certainly fun at the start. I think we all got probably pretty tired of it after a while, but it was really important in the early days when you were really focused on maintaining culture. And because we'd split ourselves into a team A, team B type scenario, we then had a silent cold war between team A and team B in terms of who could theme themselves best for their Friday afternoon drinks, little things like that. But it just became an excuse for interactions and banter outside of what was a very stressful time work-wise. So those things stood us in good stead. And the other thing that really was interesting for us was, because of the nature of our business, particularly in the private wealth sphere, it is a business very heavily built on trust. You've got a very important role, essential role in helping work with the clients and their families in looking after their financial future and potentially the next generation's financial future. And that's a trust-based role. It was very hard to build the level of trust required with new people coming in digitally. Yeah. So that personal meeting, that the eye to eye, the ability to come in and almost see the office and know it's there and tangible and safe, and get a strong identity for the potential advisor that they were going to entrust, was a big impediment for a number of months. So we saw, having started 2020 with great engagement with new clients, we saw that completely almost pause for 2, 3 months, 4 months, while those meetings were not happening personally. And then as we get into the later part of 2020 and things in New South Wales at least were significantly improving, people were happy to come back to the office. We were fortunate that we have a large office and lots of space so we could meet the requirements. Once people started to meet with us personally again, then very quickly traction began to build and get going again. But it emphasized, if it was in any doubt, I guess, the personal nature of what we do and the trust nature of what we do. And that even as good as the technology is, it cannot replicate an environment from a client's perspective to generate the trust.
It's a really interesting one. And this concept of trust, trust is hard to build and it's easy to break. And I think as each of your clients or prospective clients were going through COVID, a lot of people were having the mental challenge of, what does this mean for my retirement? Or what does this mean for my money? And there was a level of uncertainty, to your point, communicating, having a conversation. So for the clients that have been with you for over lots and lots of years, they know and they kind of trust you. Newer clients or getting people on board is definitely harder. And I think that people say, we've been able to navigate to using digital and video conference. And yes, and it all works. But when you're trying to build really strong relationships where people really can trust, it's harder, right, on video conference than it is actually seeing people face to face and having that conversation in person.
Yeah, and I know that I've read and listened to various podcasts and other things where people have shared a range of views around that. But that was our personal experience, the nature of the work that we do, and that it was just hard to replicate, impossible to probably replicate the required intimacy of that in-person meeting.
And then we talked a little bit about this, but I wanted to ask specifically around resilience and adaptability, right? So 2 kind of buzzwords that are out there, but people are talking about, what does it mean to you personally and professionally?
I think someone that gets to this type of a role, they inevitably are going to have been successful. They're going to have had more, let's say, wins than they will have had setbacks in their life along the way. But the comment I would almost make is they'll be lucky if they've certainly had a few of the setbacks. If they've got here with almost no setbacks, then unfortunately they're going to hit a speed bump at some point in the future, and that's going to be tough, very tough for them mentally. So I think I really reiterate probably some of the points I've made before. It is about how you set your own expectations for yourself and what you're likely to experience on a given day, week or month or year. If you're aspiring, for perfection, or if you're aspiring for that disruption-free day, and if you're going to get hugely upset because the day is now disrupted by one of the spinning plates dropping, well, you're going to cause yourself enormous amounts of energy loss and pain along the way there. So get your mindset right. You have to have, as cliched as it is, there's a certain amount of thick skin required here. You have to be able to just roll with some of the things that come your ways interpersonally, professionally, and manage your mindset accordingly, and know when to call it a day. I think know what you need to do to recharge, know what you need to do to keep good equilibrium in your world, because you could go to 120% for the next month, but where are you going to be in 6 or 12 months' time? So there's a delicate balancing act that the reality, again, this probably goes back to loneliness bit of the job. Only you know where that sits for you. And you have to read your own warning signs for when the time is right to go grab some recharge.
Yeah, and it comes back to what we spoke about right at the beginning of the podcast around one of your themes around the sustainable growth, right? So as you kind of mentioned on that as well, being able to sustain your career and, the graduates and the people who are coming in new, and it's not, people say it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, and that goes for your personal life and your professional life.
Oh, but it's very true. And unfortunately, the amount of times I see that people can't run the marathon, they've hit the wall, particularly in corporate world. And we see it with a lot of clients in the corporate world. It is challenging. So, trying to find that balance, and it's not easy, and there's no silver bullet to it, to be honest.
No.
But, if they can find that balance and then be really ruthless at maintaining it, and that's easier said than done.
Yeah.
That's really the key to that sustainability over the longer term.
And also sometimes people look at other people and say, oh, they're doing that and they're doing that, but being clear about what you want to achieve, and to your point, where your limits are, both physically and mentally and everything, are different to other people and are different in different parts of your life cycle and what's happening in your personal life as well. So being able to kind of be understanding yourself enough to be able to know what they are and what those boundaries are for you, and not getting lost about what other people are doing, I think is really important.
Yeah, that's an awesome point, and I couldn't agree with that one more. I think one of the worst things that you can possibly do to yourself is try to benchmark yourself against someone else in your world, and think, well, look, this person's able to achieve, maybe do these things. They're doing this philanthropic work. They're doing all this. They're running triathlons on the weekend. They're working. They're achieving all these things corporate wise. The reality is, you have no idea what's going on in their world. You have no idea what's going on in the world. Unfortunately, it might be a house of cards and it's about to fall down, and sometimes it is, and hopefully it's not. But what some people portray publicly, and what they're dealing with themselves internally or working through in other parts of their world, you've no idea. And if it is obviously the cliche of social media, and everyone's there, posting the wonderful pictures of their family and their world and everything's perfect. They're not posting the realities of what's going on in their world. And that is affecting people's mental health, because they're feeling like, I need to be perfect. My world needs to be perfect. And no one's is.
No one's is. Yeah.
You've got to find the right balance for yourself, really ruthlessly try and stick to it, and really not get sucked in by trying to do any sort of keeping up with the Joneses way of professional world of, needing to be on 24/7.
Yeah, I think it's really good advice. And my last question today is, when you're not working, what do you do that gives you energy and gives you a smile? And what's that balance piece for you?
Yeah, I'm pretty lucky in that the way my mind works, I'm quite compartmentalized. So when I'm at work, I'm very, very focused on work. But when I, sort of begin to leave the office, I can quickly begin to sort of dial back, and certainly on weekends dial back. There's various things. I'm lucky to live in the northern beaches of Sydney, so I can go for a quick run around Narrabeen Lake, which is an easy flat run because I'm no athlete. So that helps. And when I do that, I usually will have a podcast on the go, or maybe music. And even small things, like as much as I love where I live, it's a bit of a commute to North Sydney where our office is. And I used to somewhat resent that commute, but I've now found ways to sort of make that an energy charge period of my day. So depends on where my mind's at. Sometimes in the morning, I'll be onto the news. Sometimes it'll be a podcast, and whether that's more of a business podcast or maybe I like a lot of Irish sports type podcasts because it gives me a bit of a link back to feeling a bit more linked back to Ireland. And some days you're just mentally cooped, so that's just throw on a playlist and listen to a bit of music, and that's my recharge. But I found that as an environment, as I said before, where I actually can make quite good decisions, because suddenly I'm isolated in that world. And if I am really mulling something in my head, then it'll be probably just radio off, silence as I bounce something around. But the advantage of 30 minutes of no interruptions, sometimes you get those light bulb moments. And and the lack of traffic through COVID has certainly made it a slightly less stressful experience as well. I'm not sure how long that will last, as well as 1,001 family kids activities on the weekend, from softball to I coach basketball. I know nothing about basketball. So if there's any listeners there that know anything about basketball that want to reach out to me and offer to give me a bit of a hand on the basketball coaching, I can do with that. But a variety of other activities there, which I like to be busy. So that keeps my weekend moving.
Yeah, I think they're great. I mean, I think everyone's got to find what works for them, that using the commute. I think actually a lot of us have lost that commute or had lost that commute in COVID and realised how important it is just to change the gear rather than being on the whole time, but actually changing the gear between work and back to home and back to work. And giving yourself also just a headspace just to actually either tune into something or actually use the time to really kind of mull on something, I think is really fantastic. And to your point, it is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And so really it's about how do you find that right balance for you and your family and your personal life, as well as making sure that you're in the best headspace from a professional's perspective is also so important. So thank you so much, Vince, for your time today.
You're very welcome. I've greatly enjoyed the chat.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. I think a couple of takeaways from my perspective, that whole concept of sustainable growth, both on a professional level and a personal level, I think is really, really interesting. We're all navigating charted waters and there's a lot of change, but how do you lean in and take that opportunity from the change rather than worrying about the ambiguity of the change? That's both on a professional level and a personal level as well. I think running your own race and some of the conversations that you and I have had about people really running their own race, embracing the fact that they're not always going to get it right, embracing the fact that it's not always going to be perfect, but actually that's where they're going to learn, I think is really, really important. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been great to have a chat with you today.
You're very welcome. I've greatly enjoyed it. Thank you, Joe.